Hello everyone, how's it going? So in this video I would like to show you how to model a simple glass, give it a simple glass material, also add a water mesh, add bubbles to it and add some imperfections to the glass, some fingerprints. We'll also be taking a look at lighting and we will also be doing a quick setup to add some dust on the floor that's very simple and works most of the time, especially with certain camera settings. So this is targeted towards beginners and I like to keep it as simple as I could. Now first of all we would like to start with a circle and I will give this circle 28 multiplied by 2, so 56 ridges, and multiply them by 2 again. I also want to have the diameter of this cup to be around 10 centimeters, right? So I will be checking with that later on. Now, with that also being mentioned, what I would like to do is extrude it to a relatively realistic height. Make sure to always refer to Google for exact measurements, which is what I'm doing here. Now, I'm trying to get it as realistic as I could to that range, right? As you could see, I want 0.1 in terms of the diameter. Apply the scale, and also I want to add some bevel to the ridges. As you could see, I like to go for the percentage, and for the type of how to specify, I like to go for the bevel weight crease so I can get a lot more control over it. Now I'm trying to give it a base, which is why I will be having the loop tools add-on enabled in order to have a relatively circlish smooth base. I'm using it here by left click or right click and extruding it again and again and doing it to stay as consistent as I could. So here again, I'm just doing the simple extrude again, and to end this with some triangles, I did a merge in center. Here I am also beveling, trying to get a relatively good shape for our base. Now it's time to give it thickness in order to render correctly. I gave it a certain thickness, did the same exact thing which I did with the base. As you could see, extrude, scale, and merge in center. Also, I'm trying to give this lid a bit of supporting loops for once I add the subdivision. Doing the same thing on the inside and the outside. Adding some support loops for the sake of shading. Now adding some subdivision, I forgot the supporting loops inside. Now again, just playing around with this, trying to make it work. So I really urge you to model this from scratch, or you could use something that's from online, but it would be better if you model it. Now at this point, our glass is finished and modeled, so I want to have a sort of environment for it. Now when making environment, it's always smart to have your camera first thing in order to model only the things that you need to shade the things that you will be seeing. I want an aspect ratio of 1. I'm adding some thirds to help me balance this whole composition out. I want this cup to be the center of our scene. Play around with the Shift Y in order to not have any distortion whatsoever. Now I will be going back to this later on. However, this is a relatively good base to start with, which we will have to later on improve once we add the lighting. Now here I am making sure that nothing is flipped, right? We want everything to render correctly. Go to edit mode, Shift N, it will fix everything up. If not, Alt N to flip the vertices. Here I am just playing around with lighting, adding a simple sky texture and playing out with its settings. I like to also always up the ozone, right? I remove the sun disk, have the ozone up to around 4, which makes the scene more bluish. Here I am also playing with the strength, and playing with the angle to have a relatively decent starting point, which we will be building upon later on. Just playing around with the angles, with the sun rotation. And now at this point, I would like to add my material. This is very simple, as you would imagine, simple glass. Rendering does everything for you, just set it up. I like to set the transmission to 0.96 up to 0.99 depending on the material. Here you could see I'm just trying to have a sense of how this is all looking. At this point, I will be applying some caustics, which is relatively new to cycles. It won't look as obvious as it's supposed to. However, there are ways to fake that I might be sharing in the future. For now, I will be just doing this simply. I will also add a different material to the outer shell in order to have fingerprints. Fingerprints wouldn't obviously be on the inside. Doing almost the same exact material for both of these. Here I'm just showing you from where to get the fingerprint, ambient CG or any other source. I have my own, right? From models that I already have or textures that I have available on my disk. You plug it into the roughness, you unwrap your mesh. It's very easy since it is relatively a glorified cylinder. You set it up, you rotate, you make it look as relatively good as you could. Should also make it a non-color, right, for it to show up correctly. Add a color ramp to have more control. I want to crush the contrast a bit since I did not want a very dirty and disgusting cup. Just some slight imperfection that is barely noticeable. As you can see, again, I will be trying to add a bit of a frosting to the lower part, as you could see here. It's relatively easy to get down using a gradient to mix between both of the materials and add in it. As you can see here, I will be inverting it instead of inverting the material swabs, right? And also a color ramp to help me play around with this. You could improve it as much as you could. You could use the position factor in the geometry node, which would greatly help you. However, I wanted to show you this gradient techniques which will come in handy in the future tutorials, hopefully. Just have a bit of a fumed type of look in the lower part of this cup. Now at this point, I want to add a concrete material to the floor, which I will be modifying. I'm using a Megascans texture as a base, unwrapping it, rotating it, and trying to get it to look okay. Megascan textures, right, or materials come up a little bit funky out of Megascans, right? So oftentimes the bump is swapped and it lacks a bit of contrast in this, which is why I overlaid a different wall texture on top of it, which I have access to. Here I am just applying it on the outer walls, to have something to reflect on, which is the reason I wanted this. If I keep it purely white, the reflections would look extremely bad. Now at this point, I'm just playing around with the material, trying to make it look as good as I could. Adding a bit of clear coat to materials, even if it doesn't make sense to have them there, might help you a little bit if you want a wet look per se, or if you want this sort of shiny look. I'm also adding a plain light, which will help me highlight the glass, right? So, and also add a bit of a highlight. I'm playing around with this angle, with its blend or angle. I'm playing around with its strength, with its size, with all sorts of properties that we can use. Now I will be adding the cup, which I will duplicate the inner part of our glass in order to make the water mesh. Just sliding it around, right? Adding a bit of a sledge to it in order to emulate tension of water hitting the surface, the sides of the glass. Beveling, adding some support loops for once I add the subdivision to look correct. And I will be adding almost the same material, right? We don't want clear water, so this is why we want to be adding any absorption volume, which would make sense to have in water materials. However, for this case, we don't really need it since we don't have much light to begin with. It will look a bit different if we do that. Now here I am just going back to the floor material, plugging the albedo texture inside the roughness to have a bit of a highlight, playing around with the light to have this sort of natural vignetting, right, to emulate a window. Now I will be adding some bubbles to the water mesh. I'm adding some very low poly spheres, making them look a bit different and making them into their own collection, applying their scale and applying their origin back. I will also be doing a particle system set to volume and random in the source. Now at this point, we will have to make a collection in order to scatter them inside of our water. Add the collection, play around with the scale, right? And always make sure that you're viewing it through the rendered mode to see how good it looks, especially with water being reflective and the IORs wrapping around the reflection and making them sometimes seem different than what we would like them to look. So you have to compensate for that. I'm adding a simple material. It's wise to play around with its IOR to the bubbles, right? Or I'm just taking a look around, playing again with the lighting. I don't want as much contrast as I have. Now I will be adding the dust on the floor. As you could see, same thing applies as we did to the bubbles. It's just the material and the slide that is slightly different. You could go ahead and add some very fancy types of dust particles, right? You could make them with curves, you could make them with nerves, you could make them with other types of meshes that we have access to. So doing the exact same thing with the particle system, source to random, collection, playing around with the rotation for it to make sense, and playing around with the number and scale, as well added some random scaling, right? And at this point, I would like to have these scattered only where the camera sees them. So I am doing that in front of you, adding a group, right, and choosing it in the scattering settings. As you could see here, I'm playing around now. I will be adding a simple material, right? I will probably keep it a little bit dark-ish, right? Might give it a slight tint if you want, and give it less opacity in order for it to look like actual dust. Now always make sure to play around with it rendered in order to see how it looks. Since we did play around with its alpha, it will look less noticeable from our viewport, so that you should be taken care of. Now it's time for it to add some camera improvements and some blur, per se, some depth of field. I added an empty inside of the glass so I can have as much control as I want. I am playing around with the f-stop, and at this point I will be adding just some simple camera effects, which you can do in the compositing. For this case, I'm using a simple add-on that I have that's called Photographer. You do not have to use it, and you could do the exact same thing using the default Blender compositor, which this is built upon. However, it just makes it a bit more convenient. So in summary, we saw how to model a simple glass, we saw how to give it materials, we saw how to add imperfections and where to add imperfections. We also saw how to add a water mesh. We also saw how to add bubbles inside of it. We saw how to add dust and how to light this whole scene. And that's it.